All right. Well, our guest for today has been incredibly patient, and I want to bring her on because we're going to have a fantastic conversation about how the left can strategize to accomplish some policy goals. Joining us now is TV producer and writer whose work has appeared on The Atlantic, Slate, Pacific Standard, and Jacobin, Natalie Shure. Natalie, thank you so much for taking the time to come speak with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I'm really excited because I love following your work, and I've been meaning to have a discussion with you on TYT, but it's great that you're here with us on Jacobin. And, you know, you've been pretty involved in the debates that have been taking place very much online regarding a floor vote on Medicare for all. And I wanted to start off with a question that's kind of related. It has to do with a vote that just took place in the Senate. 41 Democrats voted to block Bernie Sanders' effort to demand that the Senate have a vote on $2,000 direct checks to Americans as part of the relief package. Again, 41 Democrats voted along with Schumer to block Bernie's effort in doing that. And what Bernie was using for leverage, of course, was a unanimous consent vote on, passing the National Defense Authorization Act, something that, everyone seems to really, really want. Democrats voted against Bernie in that effort. I bring that up because $2,000 direct checks to Americans is wildly popular across the board. Doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or Republican. This pandemic has put you in a crisis, an economic crisis. People desperately need that relief. And yet, after these 41 Democrats were willing to put their name on blocking Bernie Sanders' effort, there was no groundswell. It appears that it didn't even really get much attention in the corporate press. Progressive media, of course, covered it, but there was no groundswell. It didn't lead to some sort of unrest. It didn't lead to any type of activism or organizing. And so why do you think that is? Why do you think it is that this vote happened and it didn't really lead to much change or reaction?
Yeah, I mean, I think that vote was really unconscionable. And I think that a lot of people, I'm sure, watching this show would absolutely agree. And I think that what that shows is that popularity of a given measure doesn't necessarily translate into grassroots power that you actually need to force politicians to do things. Just because something's popular, it doesn't necessarily mean that people have built the alliances, that they've done the deep organizing that actually get people out onto the streets, that actually, get people to occupy offices of elected officials, that get them to make calls, that get them to march, things like that. And that those things are really, really difficult. And they're extremely important, but they take a lot of time. And you can't necessarily just snap your fingers or tweet about something and automatically enlist that groundswell and deploy people the way that you need them to be deployed. That is a long and difficult game.
One thing that struck me throughout this whole debate, and it's something that I mean, when it first kind of happened, and I just when it first started, and I saw this proposal, I was relatively agnostic towards it in the sense that I was like, this is some sort of like very insidery maneuver that may or may not be positive, or like it didn't strike me as anything that important or anything that was going to move the ball in any direction that meaningfully. But one thing that struck me was that a lot of people that have been involved in the fight for Medicare for all at the organizational level for many years, people like yourself, you've written tons on healthcare policy over the last few years. Your husband Adam Gaffney as the head of the PNHP for several years, the DSA Medicare for All caucus. Tim Faust, who wrote a very important book on called Health Justice Now, and has been a long time sort of healthcare activist and organizer, involved in the Idaho Medicaid. Like all the people who kind of been working on this issue as not necessarily as part of their full-time job, but as a sort of their key part of their political work, we're not like very enthusiastic about this particular tactic, and have sort of talked about the need for a different kind of organizing strategy. And I guess I just wanted to ask you, as one of the people who have been a long time healthcare, both expert and activist, what does that look like? What does that kind of organization look like?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I'll preface it by saying I think that there are people who support Force the Vote that I greatly admire, that are rank and file activists in some cases, that are doing so in good faith. Ultimately, I mean, it's a tactic, and it might be a good tactic, it might be a bad tactic. Either way, whether or not it happens, whether or not someone supports it, I think that the path forward still looks similar either way. I think that, a reason that I was somewhat skeptical about the idea, and that some other longtime organizers were, is because, it is difficult to marshal the organizing power to make things like this effective, that I was mentioning before. And that if something like this were to happen, and that people backing it most fervently, I think it has to be regarded as part of a strategy to, if the goal is to expose Democrats for not supporting this thing during a pandemic, which, it can be a galvanizing thing for people. I understand why they're interested in doing that. Then there's still there's still work that needs to be done as a result, right? So if you're exposing Democrats, okay, what does that mean moving forward? Well, that's probably, a locally specific question. So something like, people who support this tactic might be interested in, zeroing in on a few reps that they think are particularly hostile toward Medicare for all, that are in districts that are maybe more amenable to the idea. I think that that's somewhat close to the Justice Democrats model. There's a good chance that in some of those districts, there might already be a campaign, or there might already be people who have experience working with insurgent primary candidates, and that, someone who is a Support the Vote fan would be a really incredible addition to an organizing group along those lines. In states like New York and California, there are really active state-level single-payer coalitions, because those are states in which conditions are friendlier to single payer right now, and that have had organizing coalitions that have developed over the course of several years, that have, pushed the ball forward, where people are doing educational events, where they're working on building that deep and broad support for what I think we can all agree is a really morally urgent reform in the United States. So that's already happening in certain states. Anyone who's a proponent of Force the Vote and Medicare for All and is in a union has a really great opportunity to lobby their union, to organize with rank and file that also support Medicare for All, and really try to push this to the front of their union's agenda and try to tap into their union's power to win this thing. I think that that's something that the Medicare for All movement needs to do more of in general. I think that the labor component of this can be really difficult. There's also, the idea that people can organize a union if they're not currently in one and they're a worker. That's obviously not a super fast road, and I understand people's frustration with that. But that's, I think a way forward to, get to change the political tides in the way that we need to change the political tides. And there's also, just educational canvases in the districts of Democrats who don't support this but should. There are DSA chapters, there are, NNU groups, there are healthcare advocates already doing that in many different communities. You can join a canvass, and even if there's not, a specific legislative demand on the table in a given district, speaking to the reps to make sure that, the idea of exposing Democrats for not supporting this during a pandemic, whether or not a floor vote happens, we already have a list of people who are co-sponsors, who aren't co-sponsors, or even people who are co-sponsors that, there's reason to believe that they're maybe not, as fervently dedicated. I think that people can still use that as, an opportunity, basically a peg to go knock on doors and start to develop more support for this demand.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think first of all of the various details that you mentioned right now are important. This argument that we absolutely need to do this, this vote because it's going to identify who we need to target, which Democratic lawmakers we need to target. I just think that that's such a weak argument, considering we already know. And I'm not just talking about people who have co-signed on that legislation, but don't actually genuinely support it. It's not that difficult to look into who funds the campaigns of these Democratic lawmakers, who cynically, signs on to legislation in order to appeal to the progressive base, but doesn't actually support it. I mean, we already have names of people who are on the record saying they oppose Medicare for all. And so what are the Force the Vote people doing in organizing in order to maybe primary those individuals? And if the effort is to primary lawmakers who aren't on board for progressive policies, well, it is kind of interesting that most of the discussion that I've heard about primarying has focused on going after actual progressives in Congress who have been trying to fight for these things, who are on our side, and we need to strengthen their numbers in Congress, right? We need to specifically target corporate Democrats, but it doesn't seem like that's really what this is about. The conversation has centered on AOC and how AOC allegedly isn't doing enough because she's refusing to go on various shows and podcasts for people's vanity projects. Anyway, yeah, I've had enough of this, basically. So if you're friendly to this nonsense that's going on right now, you're not going to enjoy my commentary. I don't want you to, go after Natalie or Nando for that. You can go after me, but let's call this what it is. One other thing is, Natalie, prior to this becoming a thing, right? The idea of using leverage against Nancy Pelosi's speakership, you had actually written about it in Jacobin. Now, right now, as you're mentioning incredibly important strategic maneuvers, and you're highlighting certain flaws with this whole Force the Vote effort. You're being called all sorts of ridiculous names. You're a sellout, corporate this, whatever. But in reality, in November of 2020, November 13th specifically, you published this in Jacobin. You wrote, "There are ample opportunities for leftists and progressives in Congress to wield their power to reorient party priorities, starting with opposing Nancy Pelosi's reelection as House Speaker." So, oh, wow, that's interesting. Looks like Jimmy Dore wasn't the only person who had this idea. You also write that the left flank of the House can parlay their small numbers into exerting an outsized influence. While this coalition's power stems largely from its ability to marshal media attention and outside support, they'll soon outnumber the margin of majority held by House Democrats, who lost several seats in an election seen as a shocking disappointment down ballot. Opposing Pelosi's reelection as Speaker would be an early opportunity to test the concept, apply pressure, and win concessions if they come up short, the same way a smaller and weaker group of progressive legislators did in 2018, brokering key committee assignments for their votes and turning congressional hearings into agitprop. So you didn't specify or demand a vote on Medicare for all, but you did talk about the importance of identifying the leverage that these progressives have. So you are in favor of challenging Nancy Pelosi. Can you elaborate a little more on, what you were getting at in this Jacobin piece?
Sure, yeah. So I think no one on the left should harbor any illusions about Nancy Pelosi being on our side. She's obviously not. She holds a lot of structural power that would be held by another corporate Democrat if and when she is challenged. So I think that people should also, not harbor illusions about what it means to replace her. But certainly progressives can and should use their leverage and I think function more as a bloc, the way that, the Progressive Caucus has said not only that they're going to try to function more as a political bloc and, enforce more ideological discipline, but that they're also going to, be a little stricter about who could be part of Progressive Caucus and, what it means to be part of the Progressive Caucus so that people like Nancy Pelosi can't just be in it by paying dues and, without meeting any standards. So I think it'll be interesting to watch how that happens. The leverage that they have is real, but shouldn't be overstated. I think that, it just started breaking last night. I can't say that I've read too much of the news about this, but, using progressive power to eliminate things like PAYGO, which might not necessarily pay dividends this term, given, the makeup of the Senate and who Joe Biden is and who's still holding power, but does set a precedent for future terms that will be incredibly important for anyone who supports Medicare for all, the Green New Deal, et cetera. I think that the fact that, the force the vote argument, I think, does rely on political spectacle and theater largely, and that's not a bad thing. There have been really effective uses of agitprop and political theater. I think that we've seen that to some degree over the past few years with committee assignments and with, the way that the squad, Katie Porter, some others have been able to use their position in congressional hearings in ways that we've seen less of in the past. They also used leverage last term to get hearings on Medicare for all that are entered into the congressional record, which I think have also been important elements of political theater. Most importantly, Nancy Pelosi right now is almost certainly going to become the next speaker because we don't have an alternative. We don't have a campaign with the numbers. When I say we, the progressive left and certainly the more progressive left members in Congress haven't rallied behind an opponent yet, and they should definitely start thinking about that very soon, so that they are able to, counter someone like Hakeem Jeffries, who is discussed as, the heir apparent whenever Democrats next control the House.
Can you explain what PAYGO is?
So PAYGO is a rule that I believe instituted in 2007 that was designed to, you're not allowed to start any new spending without eliminating old spending. So it's a budget balancing measure, which is obviously, based on some, I think, pretty outdated economic ideas, as far as I understand, and is also obviously a massive roadblock to passing anything with on the order of spending that Medicare for all and Green New Deal will have.
Yeah, it's an incredibly important carve out for legislation like the Green New Deal, like Medicare for all. I mean, these it might appear as though it's nothing more than like small, subtle changes. But what it does is it essentially makes it easier to pass this type of legislation as soon as you have enough support in Congress to have this vote, right? And what I think is incredibly fascinating is how much this is being minimized by the force the vote people, as if this wasn't a giant impediment on actually passing Medicare for all. So I agree with you on the theater. I think theater is part of getting legislation passed, but it's not the end all be all. The organizing, of course, is an important portion of this. You need a multi-pronged approach. You need to ensure that you get rid of roadblocks ahead of time, so when the vote happens, you're actually able to get it passed, and you don't have these issues about, PAYGO standing in the way. And Ryan Grimm is the one who reported on this and tweeted about it as well last night, saying progressives in the House have won a rules change that would allow Medicare for all, a Green New Deal, or other big ticket agenda items to be exempted from PAYGO. This was a necessary step in opening the way for it. And AOC also chimed in on this, saying, these rule changes are a big deal, and not only on healthcare, they are structural changes in the House that level the playing field for a full suite of flagship legislation, locks in that field for the next 2 years, and establishes precedent for after. This is not easy, or this was not easy. And, she didn't detail what progressives were up to behind the scenes when this force the vote debate started on Twitter, but My guess is this was part of the strategy that she was alluding to without giving much detail on Twitter, because, yeah, you need to get corporate Democrats on board to vote in favor of carving out these exceptions for PAYGO. Again, I just think it's interesting that these are the types of things that get minimized. I get it. People are angry. I'm angry too. When I'm angry, I do all sorts of things that feel good in the moment. But then later I reflect back and think, oh, maybe that was a little counterproductive. Maybe I should have been a little more strategic in how I responded to that. I feel like that's what's happening this moment. And it's really shameful, because all it's really done is it hasn't accomplished a damn thing, and it's divided the left, when in reality we should be fighting in solidarity to get these policy goals accomplished. That was more of a statement than a question, but feel free to jump in.
That's true. And it kind of leads me to, one important thing that I don't necessarily think has been brought up a lot. When it comes to exposing Democrats who are the roadblocks here, I think you bring up some good points that, it doesn't necessarily do that. And, why would there be necessarily a difference in exposure between who's co-sponsoring a bill that isn't about to pass versus who's voting for a bill that isn't about to pass? I don't think those would necessarily be different people. So, I'm not sure that we'd be exposing any, new sham co-sponsors. But more than that, I think that what we have to back up and realize here is that, when it comes to what Medicare for All is, it's an absolutely urgent, important and moral demand that we absolutely have to fight for. It's also really big. It's, arguably the most downwardly redistributive piece of legislation in American history. It fundamentally upends a $3.5 trillion industry. Now, of course, different parts of that industry are affected in different ways by Medicare for All, but it does fundamentally change how they're paid. It changes their business model. The degree of confrontation with capital here is, just mind-boggling and immense. And so what we have to realize is that means, and they haven't even really started pushing back against us yet, right? Like there's the United Industry Group for against single payer that's put in about, I think, $5 million. We have to expect when Medicare for All builds momentum, when we do start getting more powerful and getting closer to the realm where this can actually be passed, there's basically no limit to the amount of money and opposition that they will throw at us. And in that context, who's really for Medicare for All and who's who are the ones who are going to try to wiggle out of it? I think we have to understand that the majority of reps are going to try to wiggle out of it unless we build the strength to stop them. And that's what we have to do. And then that's more than just, how many people support Medicare for All in, a telephone poll. That has to do with, building so much power through, the labor movement and on the ground that they feel like their hands are forced into doing this. And that's what we have to think about. And that's an incredibly daunting task. I'm not trying to tell anyone it's not. And there is no, quick, fun trick. There's no hack to get us there sooner. And I think that that's a lot of the promise that people saw in Force the Vote. And we have to think more broadly, and whether or not it happens. And there were people who were, pushing it on, or who were making points on both sides for great reasons. We should all be on the same side, and we should all be, thinking broadly about how to build that pressure to, keep all of the Democrats who have co-sponsored this bill and, others that will be elected in the future, that the only way we have to force them to support this is to, make a show of people power on an order that is just not comparable to what we have right now.
This whole thing has had me kind of in a state of slight despair, because I think it strikes me as the culmination of a process that has been brewing since the defeat of the Bernie campaign, in that the Bernie campaign for president was a sort of organizing unit for the left in America. It was kind of, in a way, it was kind of like a slight version of the hack that you're talking about. I mean, there is no left power anywhere in the world, anywhere in history, without labor power. And the United States right now has the lowest labor power it's had in 100 years or in 70 years. And without that kind of organizing unit, which was the Bernie presidential campaign, were revealed to not have any actual power. And what we're seeing is a sort of, it's kind of like a temper tantrum, or like a, just kind of a void in which this kind of thing just kind of emerges and sort of takes over the conversation, and basically pits everyone against each other, and it becomes incredibly destructive. So I guess my question is, what do we do to create either a new organizing principle, kind of like the Bernie campaign, but also just more long-term build that kind of power that we need to do? I mean, it's just that's what this is kind of, I think, manifesting, is this sort of the sort of void that we're in right now, this kind of interregnum that we're in, and I don't know what comes next or what we should do next.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're on the right. When you say the Bernie campaign was sort of this cool trick, this hack, this shortcut, I think that's true. But the key was, I think that, at least my understanding of the Bernie campaign and why I was so passionate about it, why I, canvassed for him so many times in New Hampshire and Massachusetts, is because I thought that the promise of the Bernie campaign and his candidacy was that his prominence and his, presidency was potentially a hack to grow a movement. That's not typically how we think of movements, grown top down. But that he was kind of providing this organizing principle, and that's what got me excited. What he wasn't in himself was, a shortcut to getting the big things. People are right when they said, okay, but how's he going to pass it? He doesn't have the votes in Senate, and he didn't. How he was going to pass it was that he would accelerate a movement in whatever I can't say what the timeline would have been, given the fact that he didn't win, and it hasn't happened. But that he would be able to facilitate the building of a movement, which are the engines of history. We know that massive change on the order that Medicare for all would be requires a disruptive, large grassroots movement with people on the ground, and that I think that he was a way of getting there. And so I think that our marching orders are the same. The fact that Bernie hasn't won is, really, it's demoralizing in a lot of ways. And I think that there has been, some confusion. I think that there's been a sort of power vacuum, and that there's not necessarily someone leading the movement in a way that he kind of came to. But that, there are local groups who are doing these kind of things. And if there's not local groups, then people can organize on their own. But, the answer to any question of, whether or not force the vote would have happened, whether or not any procedural vote happened, whether or not we get certain types of agitprop, all of it is going to require organizing with other allies, being out in the world, and enlisting people to your side, making sure that those tactics are as effective as they can be. And so, that means that sometimes you're organizing with people that frustrate you and that you don't necessarily like personally, and that you are finding things in common with people who don't always agree with you. And, there's a different set of things that make sense on Twitter, and, how people engage with others and how you engage with them in real life and in organizing spaces. And, I think that we have to start thinking about the latter.